I don't think it's real surprising that students in general are not real confident in their clay reprocessing skills. If you happen to fall into that category, you might be interested to know that I know so many working potters who don't actually reprocess their clay. It's not funny. I was kind of in that boat. I was in that boat when I first started out making pots for my profession. And after I had thrown away a certain amount of clay, I decided that it's stupid. So I managed to put together a workable procedure that I have essentially been using ever since. And I discovered something that I've said before. Reprocessed clay is always better than fresh clay if you're doing it right. Now what I mean by doing it right, the bottom line on that is don't let it dry out. If, for example, you let your clay dry out and then slake it down, you have effectively lost everything you had gained from the fact that the clay had been used before. Similarly, if you take all your slop and reduce it to a slurry, you have lost at that point most of what you've gained from the fact that it's been used. You don't want to do it that way. It's also true that if you're doing either of those, drying your clay and slaking it down or reducing it to a slurry, in addition to having lost so much of the benefit of the clays having been used before, you're stuck with doing a tremendous amount of clay drying. And that actually ends up being quite an issue. So I'm going to tell you how I do it. Basically what you need to bear in mind is that when you're making pots, you have three categories of clay to be recycled. One is stuff that's drier than you want it to be for throwing. That would include trimming scraps, bat scrapings, even when you're putting on handles, the trimmings you get from there are going to be drier than what you want for throwing. And second category, which is mostly your throwing slop, is stuff that is way too wet for throwing. The third category ends up being primarily pots that have failed. You can have other scrap that is close to throwing consistency. And pots that have failed, what I would say to do with that, that clay can bypass the process I'm describing. That clay should be simply dried to the consistency you want, just air dried. It won't take much, wedged up, and it's ready to go. And pots that have failed, honestly, save that for pulling handles. It's far better clay. If you end up with more of that clay than you need for pulling handles, then just throw with it. But getting back to the two categories of too dry and too wet, essentially they just get mixed together in a tub of some kind. And when I say mixed together, I should amend that you don't actually want to mix them together. You don't want to do anything to pack the clay together. It actually will even out better if it is mixed and packed. The trade-off on that is that it ends up being so much work digging it out of the container you've put it all in that it's just not worth it. So these two categories of clay, the too wet and too dry, I will simply throw in a bucket that I keep covered, and when the bucket gets full, it's time to dig it out and proceed with the reprocessing process. Now when I started doing this, I was working in a larger studio, and at that time I had two 20-gallon plastic garbage can type deals, and I would just throw the clay in there. I don't think at that time I was excluding failed pots from the mix. I think everything was going in these containers. And when the second one got to be about 2/3 full, that would be when I would start digging into the first one and using the clay out of there. I remember the very first time I got into it, I looked at all this garbage that I had in there, clay scraps, and I really was not excited about using it. And as soon as I started using it, I discovered, hey, this is better than what I'm used to. At that time, originally, I was actually trying to maintain, doing the best I could to maintain the clay, the scrap clay in the containers at pretty close to a throwing consistency. And yeah, it's slightly tricky. Now what I do is I try to keep it wetter than throwing consistency, not horribly wet, but wet enough that when I dig it out I can wedge it up a little bit and air dry it until it's as dry as I want. Now if by chance you're looking at this recycling video, reprocessing video, specifically with the thought to teaching yourself to throw using the boot camp program at home, generating quite a bit of clay that needs to be reprocessed. The clay from the exercises, dry out the inside, dry it off as best you can, and that falls into that category of stuff that it just needs to be air dried a little bit and wedged up and it's ready to go. Now as we proceed with this will get into wedging, and actually that's not the right term. Wedging refers to a specific process, something I used to do when I started out, and it's a perfectly good way of prepping clay. There's one reason I quit doing it, but I'll cover that, and that'll probably end up in a second video because we're not going to have time in the 15 minutes allotted for the first one to deal with that. Final thing I'll say before we get into the actual mechanics of doing it: if you have dry clay to reprocess, yes, slake it down, pour off the water as much as you can, dry it some, and then add it to the bucket that you're doing your other clay reprocessing in. So I think it's time to get on with the actual mechanics of doing it. This is a bucket of clay, waiting to be recycled. You can see various things in here. I don't know how well you can see them. There's bat scrapings. Trimming scraps are kind of buried underneath. There's a few cut off from something, throwing slop. These chunks here are from a trimming chuck that I was done with, that was then cut up and soaked in water a little bit to soften it up before it went in here. This is just to make sure everything, and I want to point out, you don't, it makes the clay even out better if you pack it in the bucket, but the amount of additional work that that causes when you have to dig it out just isn't worth it. So don't pack it in, keep it covered. You can see this bucket is overflowing. I usually do my recycling before I get to this point. You can use a larger container if you want, as I used to. Currently I'm working in a very tiny studio, well, bigger than tiny, but it's like 14 by 14, and that's why I stick with a small container. Here's the wedging table. I have always wedged on canvas stretched over wood. You can see it has already been wet down. Whenever you're wedging on anything absorbent, really you want to wet it down in advance. You want it to be wet enough to be dark but not slippery. Now this particular canvas is something I just recently tried. It's like sold for painters, or not painting on the canvas for, you know, like, I don't know, drop cloths or something, and it's lined underneath with plastic. And it's readily available, and I thought I'd try it because I have had problems with the wood then absorbing moisture and gradually rotting out and helping to rot out the canvas too. But this stuff takes water differently. It's still slippery here, and I just wet it down, and if that's still slippery when I start, I will scrape it off so it's not slippery. Now here's the clay that was in the bucket. We've got a total of 5 individual clumps, and I'm going to show you how I proceed with the initial wedging of this stuff. Whenever I'm wedging clay of more than, that's not of even consistency, I will start, this is just barely dry enough for wedging. You can see it's sticking to the table and this is a judgment call. If it comes up clean like this, it's dry enough to work with. We'll keep incorporating this into the clay. Back to the wedging varying consistencies of clay together. I'm doing kind of a variation on the spiral kneading. I am not at this point thinking at all about excluding air from the clay, but rather mixing it together. And it's kind of like I have a dish of clay, and I'm gradually moving it around and picking up the clay on the outside and moving it to the center. Now, as I get to the point where it feels fairly uniform, I'll transition into what is a more typical spiral kneading. And all I want to do at this stage in the reprocessing is turn it into something that feels fairly uniform. Like if you're feeling hard lumps in there, you want to keep working it until you don't feel them anymore. And you want to turn this into something that's fairly smooth on the outside. These protrusions and uneven elements in the surface are going to dry more unevenly. And then this is going to be set aside to air dry. And we'll get back to that. I guess I can put this where you can see it. Here you have the clay that came out of the bucket. This is the sign that I hang on my door to remind me that I have clay out air drying.